Oscar,
Hey TJ.
how you doing, my man?
Hey, it's been good, busy, but hey, it's a good kind of busy.
All right. Well, great to see you. We are not interviewing someone today.
Mhm.
In fact, we are going to answer what one of our Instagram followers has asked us. And so, Dawn, aka Jenny, class of 2018, asked the question, um, "What is critical race theory, and why is it so divisive?"
Critical race theory. Here it comes.
So we have this term critical race theory. So I want to start off by giving Wikipedia's definition of it.
Right.
And so what we have here is critical race theory, also known as CRT, is a body of legal scholarship and an academic movement of civil rights scholars and activists in the United States that seeks to critically examine US law as it intersects with issues of race and to challenge mainstream American liberal approaches to racial justice.
Right.
CRT examines social, cultural, and legal issues primarily as they relate to race and racism in the United States.
Right. I think that's a really good by the book definition of it, because the key word for me was it's a body of legal academic scholarship. So for people who work in the legal field or who are in law school. Now, neither one of us went to law school, right? And we're not lawyers. And so have you ever referred to critical race theory in your classes as a history teacher?
You mean like that term, like the term critical race?
Yeah, that
No,
term.
no.
No, no. And neither had I. I've been teaching for, this is my 18th year of teaching. I've never referred to it. I've never heard of it. But the definition you gave is the definition. It comes from law school and the legal academic world for understanding the intersection of race and law. So,
Well, and looking back at the history of it, it looks like its roots started in the 1970s,
yeah,
um, according to how this is grouped.
yeah,
And it's interesting that critical is in the word, because being critical or being a skeptic is something that is a natural part of learning.
yeah.
And examining biases, examining sources, um, seems like it is a natural part of learning and what historians normally do.
Yeah, I feel like we had this conversation when we were talking about defund the police, where everyone knows what defund is, we know what that means, and the police mean. But you put together, and we have all kinds of different opinions about what that actually means. And now, we know what critical means, we know what race means, we get theory, but you put it together, and it means different things to different people. But yeah, it comes to the 1970s, the legal world. But I think it's so for anyone who's interested in it, it's important to know that that's the definition of it. That's where it comes from, but it doesn't really have anything to do with what we're talking about. That has nothing to do with why you've heard about critical race theory,
So
or
why
why.
so why is critical race theory getting headlines today?
Okay, so there's a short answer and then there's a long answer. The short answer is that the Republican Party and conservatives don't really have an answer for the Biden administration and the Biden administration's response to COVID, or their stimulus plan. All the Biden administration's policies, at least the ones that have been enacted so far, are popular across the board among conservatives and liberals. And the question has been, how do Republicans respond to that? Like when I was still teaching AP government last semester, after the stimulus package was passed and it was popular, I had a conversation with my students. How do you think Republicans would answer to this? And they didn't really know how they could spin it. And the real answer was they would change the subject. So earlier in the spring, it was the border crisis. And we had to go to the border, and they were, Ted Cruz was like on a boat in the Rio Grande, in camouflage, and it was all the border crisis. But then that died down, and the question was, well, what's the answer now? And out of somewhere, you started hearing about critical race theory, and that really sort of caught on. And so that's why we're talking about it, because it is a way, it's a way to direct grievances from the right against the Biden administration. And it's such a vague term that people can understand it to mean whatever they think is scary about the United States today, because it's changing, and the left in particular. So it's sort of this vehicle that is empty because people don't know what it means, and you can just load it with everything that scares people on the right to get them riled up to show up to school board meetings, or get them to march, or get them to, vote eventually. It's a recruiting tool to get the right engaged for the midterm election.
Hold on a second. I'm actually like imagining a vehicle, and
Yeah.
like you're loading it up with these foreigners are going to take your jobs, and then you're loading it up with um, terrorists are coming in, and then you're loading it up with Black Lives Matter, our militants who are now going to do things.
Yeah.
This group is going to defund the police because
All critical race theory. It's all critical race theory.
all of these are all like weapons that are being thrown in this literal, in my mind,
Yeah.
a van or a truck.
Yeah.
And each of these weapons is thrown in there and then just sent riding along. That's my imagery.
Yeah. One of the big proponents on the right basically said, we want to brand critical race theory and make it toxic. So we're just going to be repeating how crazy this stuff is, and we're going to load it. We're going to associate it with everything that they hate about the left. So yeah, whether it's immigration, defund the police, trans rights, which is not about race theory, but just everything on the left will just get loaded into that, and it'll be toxic. So when anytime you say anything that about civil rights, or are you teaching critical race theory? Because I know it's negative, and you're teaching that, or immigration or anything else, they'll just associate it with critical race theory, which is bad by definition. Therefore, you're brainwashing kids. And it can be very powerful because it can mean whatever it needs to mean for anybody to be angry about the Biden administration. Because Biden is not scary. He's Joe Biden. Critical race theory is scary because of everything that people are scared about in the ways that the United States is changing. And it's a convenient, vague term to weigh down with all those things.
But I mean, it was a term that was used before the Biden administration, though, with the 1619 project and the reaction to that, because the 1619 project is looked at as being one of like a critical part. Sorry to use critical twice, of critical race theory. What was the reaction to that? And did that happen before the Biden administration?
That is a great example of how they've taken critical race theory and they've taken something else they don't like and then associate it. The 1619 project has nothing to do with critical race theory. It's looking critically at race in American history. And it's actually very optimistic work. So I picked it up. So for people who don't know what the 1619 project is, so 2019 was the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first enslaved Africans into Virginia. It's not the first enslaved people that stepped for the United States, because Florida was a Spanish colony. There had been over 100 years of slavery already in the Caribbean, but it's significant in that it's Virginia was a colony that became the United States. So these were the first enslaved people that set foot into a place that became the United States as an English colony. So it was marking that moment, 400 years, and then looking at the history of the United States, making the case that slavery is central to the history of the United States. And Nicole Hannah-Jones, well, first of all, it's optimistic. The first essay is about her dad, who was a veteran who used to fly the American flag every day. Despite the fact that he lived through the Jim Crow South and dealing with racism, the idea was, why are Black people proud of the United States? Why are they so loyal and dedicated to the United States when this country doesn't love them back? And he believed that he and people like him made the United States a multicultural democracy. That the idea is that Black people and other people made the United States a multicultural democracy. And so he wasn't going to give up on it, even though the country had never, merited that love. And so it's optimistic, but something in another essay, she made the case that some of the people who declared independence from Britain did so in order to maintain slavery. And that's not the story of the American Revolution that we'd like to tell. We'd like to tell the story of the American Revolution about, no taxation without representation, the consent of the governed. And the fact is that there were some people in Virginia who were rebelling against Britain because they believed that Britain was going to undermine the system of slavery. That's not the reason why everyone declared independence. But for some people, the fact that they believed that Britain was going to free the slaves, that did play into why they wanted to cut off ties with Britain. And she got a major backlash from that.
And so this is one aspect of critical race theory that I think is sometimes is often criticized, which is it gives nuance and stories, individual stories, to things that people want to just gloss over and have one way of thinking about. They want to think George Washington was a great man, superhero, rode horses, saved everything, won every battle. We'll ignore the ones he didn't win, but greatness.
Or we'll ignore the fact that one of his enslaved workers left him and his wife, escaped from Philadelphia and then moved up to like New Hampshire somewhere. And George Washington and Martha Washington spent the rest of their lives trying to track her down, and gain their property back. That's not a story that we like to tell about them, but it happened.
Yes, and so all of those nuances that destroy heroes is seen as being critical or bringing down and being divisive to what we've been taught, because traditionally there has never been marginalized people that have had this much power and been this educated and had this many ways of networking and coming together to actually collect, document, and display these stories, this nuance.
Yeah, people who've traditionally been excluded and marginalized are now the ones who are starting to tell the story about this country. And for people who are invested in a uncritical portrayal of their heroes, that is very threatening. And I guess that is very threatening. If you're invested in the heroic founders and you don't want to spend any time looking at, the fact that most of them were enslavers and, then probably raped the women that they held as property as enslaved people. You don't want to talk about that. Okay, but it happened, and a new generation of people that are coming of age are saying, you know what, no, we need to look at that and grapple with the nuance and make sense of that, because we have to make sense of those issues today. And so it makes sense that we would look at our history with those same concerns of today. And that means that we are going to revise the way that we look at the history. And that's very threatening. And you hear people say things like, why don't they just tell the real history? Why do they have to tell this biased history? Why do they change the history? There is no unbiased history. There is no true history. Everything that we teach in history is based on documented facts from the past that we have to then make sense out of. And there's choices involved in all of that. And we make choice. And people the history that you were taught as a kid was processed by people who made choices in terms of what they were going to talk about, what they weren't going to talk about. And that's what you learned. So it's not the true history. It's just you received a processed history based on the decisions other people made. Well, now we're looking today and say, well, you know what? Maybe we should look at women. Maybe we should look at what enslaved people went through. Maybe we should look at, the Puritans in terms of what Native Americans, in Massachusetts went through and how their lives changed for them. Maybe we should look at, the origin of the United States in the Southwest, not just in the East Coast. Maybe we should have, women writers. Again, we can make new decisions based on factual evidence, and we're going to get a different story. And that's okay. And then we're going to teach this history. And then in 10, 20 years, the next generation is going to say, well, we hadn't thought about like LGBTQ people. What about LGBTQ people in colonial times? Because they were there. There's documented evidence of transsex people in the 1600s. that people have made decision over and over again to leave that out. But a new generation is going to say, well, we should talk about that. And some people are going to say, whoa, why are you talking to our kids about these sort of things? Like, why don't you stick to the real history? That is real history. Everybody makes decisions over what you want to teach based on the concerns of today.
And
We understand the past.
That's a part that I actually want to point out, because there are people that nowadays would say, well, you know, it's like homosexuality is only happening and people are only like, things are so gay right now because they're hearing that it's an option. It's an option to be gay. And before there were no gay people because it wasn't an option. And
gay people everywhere, and not even just like gay people everywhere. It's just that even homosexual sexual encounters were not gay in the United States. Even the 1800s, like, you know, in New York City, there people were sleeping with people of different sexes, and it didn't define their sexuality. It was actually a lot more fluid. And the way that we've learned about the history of gender identity, that kind of thing, that has been the product of the decisions people made in the 50s and the 60s, this kind of conformist Cold War, to teach a certain way. That's what we learned. That's what we think is the real history. That's just the history that we learned based on the decisions that people made to include certain things and leave certain things out. Does that mean it's fake history? No. It just means that we get history that is processed by people who make decisions. You make decisions in everything that you do. The new generation will say, well, why aren't we looking at these documents and these experiences and making sense out of that? And that's going to change the story. And then the next generation, someone else is going to talk about, again, something else. And that's just the nature of history. You never stop learning history. Even the same documents, new people will go back and reinterpret them, and that's okay.
So this actually brings up like a parallel to me, which is that all of us, I don't think there's anybody I know that doesn't have family members that they find out about later.
Sure.
Because of decisions made by great grandpa, grandma, uncles, dad, and there were decisions made at one point not to include or maybe family members that weren't known about.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's after the death of a family member that half siblings are known about or other families are known about. And it's almost as if saying, well, why are you bringing this up? It's tearing down this person.
Right. When
in reality, it's just what the truth is.
That was there the whole time.
That was there the whole time.
We didn't know about. I think as history teachers, you know, I'm sure we agree, I feel a purpose to have my students understand the challenges that we are facing today.